And today we welcome the founders of the Great Jewish Food Fest, the restaurant Gefilteria, and authors of the Gefilte Manifesto, Liz Alpern and Jeffrey Yoskowitz, to our Beyachad Together, Spirited by American Jewish University program, where we have been working for ways for us to stay connected, even in this era of social distancing, by offering online learning that captures and delivers the insights of our faculty and friends and convenes our diverse and inclusive community to advance ideas, dialogue, and debate. So Liz and Jeffrey, both co-authors of the Gefilte Manifesto, New Recipes for Old World Jewish Foods, and co-owners of the Gefilteria, a food venture that's been reimagining old world Jewish foods, have a really extensive Instagram following. I urge you to follow them at Jeff Yosko, at Liz Alpern, and at Gefilteria. Welcome, Liz and Jeff. Jeffrey.
Jeff.
So much. I'm sorry?
Jeffrey, but both work fine. Yeah, thank you so much,
I
Michelle.
have a boss named Jeffrey who allows me to call him Jeff, so I apologize for that. So much of what we eat in the United States is influenced by our old country Jewish taste buds, right? Either from Eastern Europe, perhaps the Middle East, perhaps other places in the world. So as we welcome you here today, I have a real big question for the two of you. Has Jewish food melted together into one big pot, or does it still remain distinctive enough to be in a salad bowl?
Oh, Michelle, we didn't know that was going to be the opening question. It is a big one.
It's a big one, but feel free to answer. Give us your few minutes of who you are and what you do, and we'll keep going at it.
Well, the simplest answer I can give to just get started, because this is such a big question, is that we at the Gefilteria, and our mission and what we're focused on is a little bit more of the salad model, because we are Ashkenazi Jews and we are passionate about Ashkenazi Jewish food, which we're going to dive into the details of as this conversation continues. And part of why we started this company almost a decade ago now is because we saw that foods from our tradition, like a borscht or an old world pickle or blintzes or kugel, these foods were actually sort of being forgotten by our colleagues in the food world, maybe dismissed. But also what we saw was that they had lost some of their ethnic identity as Ashkenazi Jewish foods. And part of starting the Gefilteria was to counter the narrative that all Jewish food is the same, that in fact there are so many distinctive cuisines within the Jewish canon, and Ashkenazi Jewish food is just one of them. Jeffrey, I'm sure you have more to add.
I'd say lots to add, as this is full college courses on this topic. I would say your question speaks to the reality of what Jewish food is right now. I mean, even the term Jewish food, right? Is there such a thing, right? Are there Jewish foods? Is there a Jewish cuisine? Are there multiple Jewish cuisines? What is the DNA? What is the thread that combines and connects all these different Jewish food traditions? And that's sort of what I like to think about it. I like to think there is something that, obviously there are certain constraints that are shared, kosher constraints, or the flouting of the kosher constraints, in and of itself is part of that dialogue that we're having. So, which would make a Reuben sandwich, which is corned beef, Swiss cheese, and coleslaw, somehow still in that Jewish, bubble. But you also have, you have these, this DNA, this thread. You also have these forces, modernization, Americanization, globalization. So what Liz is referring to, what we were reacting to, was watching our beloved food tradition, which is a food tradition of Ashkenazi Jewish food. And you could argue that itself is not a proper term, because there's Polish Jewish food traditions, Lithuanian, there's Hungarian. We were watching ours kind of get watered down, become more American. And more Israeli. We were watching, hummus replace the chopped liver on the Shabbat dinner table. I use the term falafelization for what happened as falafel replaced pastrami sandwiches at my Jewish day school in New Jersey. And I think we were watching this homogenization happening. And what we thought was actually this was sad because we have North African friends of Moroccan, Israeli backgrounds who make the most amazing couscous and the most amazing harissa. And we were so proud of our own, our Eastern European Jewish family's background and heritage, and we didn't want that to get lost. And so we prefer the salad model, and while recognizing that there will be some kind of fusion that's happening in various different ways, and we want to celebrate that, but we want it to be the right fusion, not the watered down, bastardized version of a lot of these amazing flavorful foods to meet sort of a more Western palate. That's my long-winded answer.
I love that. I love the notion of the salad bowl, that you're able to pick out those distinctive flavors and taste them each for what they are and where they come from and the histories they represent. To our audience, we've opened our Q&A and our chat, so feel free to drop in questions for Jeffrey and Liz, and we will moderate through them and get through them the best that we can. So Liz and Jeffrey, did this desire to capture the essence of the Ashkenazi cuisine and the flavors from home, and did that really push you forward in writing and publishing the Gefilte Manifesto?
Well, I'd say that even more than capturing the essence, although we love capturing the essence, we were also interested in reimagining and kind of reclaiming this cuisine and moving it forward into the future, because it's wonderful to preserve something, right? It's wonderful to keep it as it is, but we know that traditions evolve, and so the idea is, how do we influence things to evolve in a way that maintains some of that integrity and some of that history? And so the Gefilte Manifesto, the book, and Jeffrey, maybe you have a copy we could hold up behind you. I think you do. I think I see it. So the Gefilte Manifesto, for example, has a gefilte fish on the cover, okay? And gefilte means stuffed in Yiddish. So this is an old world stuffed fish. Now, what's relevant here is that for many of us, gefilte fish is just a fish ball, right? And I know you have things to say about fish balls, Michelle, because we talked about it earlier. But I love that as an example of, we love to look back in order to look forward, to move forward. And gefilte fish, in a stuffed fish, is a great symbol of that. On one hand, it's so old school, it's, nobody even makes it anymore. But on the other hand, it's right in line with our values today of using everything in, everything that we have, and DIY, and really just trying to, do a project-based recipe. Our generation loves recipes like that. And it turns out that that was right there in our history all along. So it's a little bit of a combination of how do we look back, but then also kind of reignite some of that fire.
Yeah, so Liz, when you and I had spoken about gefilte fish, I had mentioned that I don't think I really have ever had it. My family is Moroccan background, and my life growing up was really surrounded by all kinds of spicy things. And then I started thinking about, well, maybe there is a Moroccan gefilte fish, but it's not called gefilte fish. It's boulettes au poisson, or fish balls, that my mother, this is a call out to you, Mom, that my mother so elegantly put together for us growing up. And it was always in this spicy sauce of tomatoes and harissa and peppers and cilantro and garlic. And my mouth is watering just thinking about the deliciousness that she presented, often at a Shabbat table or at a holiday table, or sometimes just midweek, because it was something really easy to make and pull together. And then I started thinking about my Argentine mother-in-law, who is of Ashkenazi background, and at Passover brings these amazing fish balls, these little patties that are breaded and fried, and thinking, well, maybe that's an adaptation of the gefilte fish from the great-grandparents who had moved from Russia to Argentina, and Milanesa is kind of popular, and anything kind of breaded and fried, and that Italian influence, and maybe it had morphed. And so here we are sitting in, in modern day time at our Passover tables, and I have all these kinds of fish balls that I didn't really imagine as gefilte fish, right? And all in their deliciousness. So I thank you for bringing that forward and helping share that. We'd also talked about
Michelle, can I say one thing? Sorry, you just your question about your initial question, and now your story of the Moroccan fish balls, and it's reminding me of one of the things that Liz and I also felt like we wanted to pushed back against when we decided to write the manifesto was this idea of standardization in Jewish food, and that post 1950 everything stayed the same. So gefilte fish always looked the same with that little oblong shaped jarred gefilte fish with a little carrot on top, or kugel, Luxon kugel, always looked the same with the cornflake crusts on top. Everything, there's one version of it all, one version of brisket with Coca-Cola or Lipton, with variations here and there. Whereas if you look into the history and you look into the amazing, regional variations and the messiness of history, right? I mean, right, a lot of Ashkenazi food was originally Italian in origin, or Jews from Italy who then traveled north. And then you have the the influence of the Scottish fishermen and the Scandinavians with the introduction of herrings and foods like that. So you kind of see that messiness and you see the diversity. And so how do you celebrate, if you celebrate the diversity of a cuisine, and you can celebrate all the different ways gefilte fish was made, whether it's baked or fried or poached or stuffed, and I think part of what we are just inspired by in general is just how to celebrate that diversity and move past that idea of there being one version of everything, and that kugel looks one way always with noodles, when there's a whole history of different kugel variations. So your beautiful Moroccan fishball story made me think of that, and I've been so curious where that the Moroccan fishballs themselves came from. And I always think of haraime as which is that kind of like a fish in a tomato sauce, which I believe is also Moroccan. And as my family in Israel is they're Mizrahi and they have North African background. And that is a Shabbat specialty every Friday, whereas in my family here, it may have been gefilte fish. It was haraime there.
So I think like gefilte fish, it was just what was available. Morocco sits on a coast, and amazing Mediterranean fish. Maybe it's the same as the carp that the carp in the bathtub. I think about that story that I read to my children when they were younger, and just really informed by the ingredients that we have available to us locally and how that morphs and changes. When you mentioned cornflakes on kugel or Coca-Cola in a brisket, they didn't have cornflakes and Coca-Cola in the old country, right? So where do those kinds of things come from? Like, how does that adaptation begin, and how does it reflect the old world?
I mean, there's so much to say, and I think that the key thing is to think about how do immigrant food traditions evolve at all, right? So any immigrant group arrives at new shores, and what they want to do is find the flavors of home as best as they can, and some flavors are easily found and some are not. So just in our tradition, one of the things that we stumbled upon was that mushrooms are a huge part of flavoring Eastern European dishes, and certainly were used in Jewish cooking in Eastern Europe. And these were foraged mushrooms. And if you go to Eastern Europe today, if you go to Poland today, you will find so many incredible mushrooms, both dried and fresh. Of course, Ashkenazi Jews came to the Lower East Side of New York, and mushrooms were, not to be foraged.
There's great foraging in the wilds of the Lower East Side.
right on the East River. So, so the idea is that you did your best. And we know that there was a short time that on Houston Street, there was an amazing mushroom trade because the Jews of Eastern Europe couldn't find the mushrooms that they wanted, and they started trading them on Houston Street. And eventually that, people got more Americanized, and they were okay with using those button mushrooms that they could buy in the market or the store. And so there's that kind of an evolution where you eventually let go of some of those traditional flavors. And then there's also a tradition of using a cornflake crust, which could have been influenced there's lots of ways we could look at this through cookbooks, right? Cookbooks help standardize, and cooking magazines help standardize the way that immigrant women cooked. And of course, big companies knew exactly how to, look at that settlement cookbook, right? Lots of good hacks. But also what my favorite example of this is from Jeffrey's grandmother, who had a plum tree growing up in her home in Shumsk, a village in Poland. And she would make jam out of this, they would make jam from the plums and make an apple strudel with this jam from the plums. And she uses Smucker's strawberry jam here in the United States because she feels like that's the best, that's the closest approximation for that. And I love that example because we get to talk to Grandma Ruth to this day, and she will defend that Smucker's jam. Am I right, Jeffrey? I mean, that is
Liz, I love that you got all the details of that so perfectly right. Obviously, we've been working together long enough, but amazing.
I love that story.
And part of it was that was what was the closest approximation in the 1950s as she was settling, into the United States after the Holocaust, and as a young refugee woman, and she wasn't going to the gourmet markets if they even existed to find plum jam. Smucker's strawberry was the closest she could find, and that's what the recipe. That's how it became codified when I wrote the recipe down as an 8-year-old, and which I did. But Liz, you told a beautiful story, but I think you gave a little bit of a pass to the dark side of the history, which is the forced assimilation. And I held up the settlement cookbook partly because this was the settlement movement in many ways was incredibly helpful for immigrant women. And there were separate Jewish settlement homes to train them how to shop in an American supermarket. If you grew up like my grandmother did in Shumsk, and you only knew of the small little markets or the exchanges that took place, the outdoor markets and stuff. But there was also an attempt to Americanize, to force, to train these people how to be American, and that meant how to cook American. That meant how to not be as outwardly Yiddish and ethnic, and to water down a lot of aspects of the culture. And so the recipes themselves incorporate modern ingredients, provide tips and tricks and shortcuts. And in some cases, these, and coincided with, the changes that took place in the domestic sphere, changes that took place in the kitchen that freed women like my own grandmother from having to slave away all day to make all these flavors from scratch, to make their own jams. And there's a lot of, you can talk, really beautiful impact that it had on the Jewish community, on women in America. And it also changed the food in some cases by really, adding Dr. Pepper or Coca-Cola into briskets, really relying on a lot of processed foods. And I think what Liz and I very much a decade ago were responding to was, how do we get back to some of the quality and cooking with love that may have been lost with these the over adoption of some of these processed foods, while still acknowledging the importance that this kind of new world order has in our lives. How do we modernize? How do we look to the future by looking to the parts of the past that most inspire us? So that's sort of been our goal.
Excellent. Thank you. This kind of leads to a question we have from our audience, where they write that they believe that some Jewish food may have gone down in popularity because there's always this perception that it wasn't really healthy, that it's filled with lots of fat and hydrogenated kinds of oils and things that'll just goop up your arteries. And I think about those old world recipes. I think for the most part, they were probably a little bit on the healthier side, but that as they changed and as they adapted the local foods, that maybe they became less healthy, right? I don't think margarine existed in the old world. So how
neither did mile high pastrami sandwiches.
Right?
Literally did not exist. Not a thing.
Or sandwiches.
Sandwiches, right? Sandwiches at all, right?
So can you eat healthy and stay close to home to these recipes we so love and adore?
Michelle, it's a great question from the audience.
Also.
Yeah, it's a good segue here. I would say there's a few. It's a complicated question because Liz, I'm gonna let you take that one.
No.
I wasn't going in that direction. It's
you weren't going in that direction.
It's a complicated question because one, how do we define health, right? Health has changed as a definition. In the 80s, what was the biggest fear in the health community? Fat, animal fats, right? These saturated fats. And today, if you talk to most nutritionists and you talk to neurologists who are studying the impacts of food on our brain cognition, they'll tell you that the absence of those fats actually, the inclusion of those fats in your diet can help ward off Alzheimer's, or ward off some certain elements of cognition deterioration. And so it's really interesting to think about what's good and what's not good. We also see right now that schmaltz, animal fats, schmaltz usually refers to poultry fats, but beef tallow, things like that are actually being sold at Whole Foods and are really hip right now, because we're seeing that what we did is we replaced these saturated animal fats with trans fats, with shortenings and with all the other buzzwords of the day. And so those weren't much healthier. And the other piece of the puzzle is that when you go to a Jewish deli, you have to recognize that the Jewish deli is not representative of what old world Jewish eating was like. It's very much a place you go to get heavy, fatty foods. That's really what makes it so special. And in fact, many of those foods, no one, if you grew up in a shtetl in parts of Poland, you likely never saw pastrami. That was very Romanian. You certainly never saw it made of beef or served hot or served on a sandwich. And it was something you ate sparingly on occasion, on a special occasion. And it was typically would have been made from goose. So right away, you're seeing that, that was something that wasn't, now we're eating it more frequently. People would maybe eat a pastrami sandwich weekly. These mile-high sandwiches, even if you weren't affluent in the old country, that's an absurd amount of meat to consume. And that was part of that American story, that abundance. And so what happened was we ended up eating those special occasion foods, the fatty foods, the heavy foods all the time. And we actually lost sight of what the everyday foods were. Whether it was your turnip salad or your, Liz is going to talk about something that I don't want to spoil because it's one of my favorite topics. Even just the fact that, when you weren't eating a festive meal, sometimes you weren't even eating a proper meal in the shtetl or in the cities in a place like Warsaw, where my grandfather was from. And so our eating patterns had changed so much. And what we saw was that the greatest hits, so to speak, the heaviest, the fattiest, the things you want to celebrate with became all that people thought of Jewish food. And Liz, you had something I really want you to get into.
Yes, that's actually quite interesting that really those are special occasion foods. They're not our day-to-day Jewish foods. But Liz, I know, brought something that can be a day-to-day food and something that I think really preserves our traditions well around the world. So go for it, Liz.
Well, I brought a jar of pickles that I made, cucumber pickles. So you can see that cloudy brine, and I will show you some slices. But the cloudy brine is a good sign. And what's really going on there is that these are naturally fermented pickles. These are pickles done the old-fashioned way, as we say, made just with a saltwater brine. So you won't find any vinegar or any preservatives. These are alive. These are great for your gut. All the things that all the benefits you'd get from yogurt, you would get from these pickles. And this is the way that people ate. This is the pickle of the Ashkenazi tradition. And we know that even when you have pickle brine mixed with some freshly fermented creams, these are really healthy foods. And now what do we eat? Pickles with all the good bacteria stamped out by vinegar, canned in a jar looking neon green. And so we might still eat a pickle, right, as part of our tradition, but these are no longer the same pickles, right? So I've got some nice slices of pickles right there. Got all that crunch up. I revealed my other item that I have here. But there's so much more. We could talk about pickles for hours, and in fact, we often do. But I think pickles are, in some ways, the essential food that symbolizes much of what was lost, right?
And Liz, can I just say, I just want to use the pastrami sandwich as an example. If you go to the deli, what is it served with? A pickle.
Pickle.
Right, and we see this big mile-high sandwich, just usually a boat of pickles. The pickle helps cleanse the palate. And so if you have a fatty pastrami, which you should have, because a lean pastrami sandwich will not taste good because it will be dry. And so have pastrami less frequently, but have it fatty when you do. And you bite that pickle, that lactic acid that is part of the fermentation process will cleanse your palate. Liz, unmute yourself. I want to hear the crunch.
It's very crunchy.
Oh, amazing, amazing. And not only that, but these pickles, Liz mentioned they're naturally fermented. They have a really healthy natural bacteria, just like yogurt, acidophilus. if anyone takes probiotics, you can eat a classic Jewish pickle, you get the same benefits, and it's going to help digest that pastrami sandwich, and it's going to support and strengthen your immune system. And this is old world, Ashkenazi nutritional wisdom at its best. And you would eat a lot more pickles than you would pastrami, and pickles were something, or some kind of pickled food, fermented food, with every meal. But pastrami would be only on a special occasion. So I love that example, Liz, and I love that crunch. Not always easy to do.
Thank you.
When we talked about the pickles and pickle culture, like every culture around the world has some sort of pickled element, right? If it's kimchi or sauerkraut, which can have the Jewishness in it, but the European, I think about the beautiful plates of Italian gardeneria with the cauliflower and the peppers. And then Liz and I had this conversation. I talked about, my favorite pickle thing. I have a jar right here. I brought it to share. Pickled lemons, which are basically preserved in just salt. And these are the ones I put up. And then I have a jar that my mother put up. Our recipes are quite similar. She just uses pure salt, squeezes so many lemons in a jar that their natural juices run out. I'm not so brave to squeeze so many lemons in a jar, so I do add lemon juice and salt. And then we have these, and these are really an important part of Moroccan cuisine. I've never not ever had these in my home, from the time I was born all the way till now, to the point now that I preserve my own. So it's what happens when you have a glut of lemons. Someone brought over this giant bushel of lemons from their tree. I slice one open and I see this nice thick pith and this nice thick skin. It's like, what am I going to do with all these lemons? Well, this is a great way to preserve them. This will last a year in the fridge because they do have quite a bite. And so I put some here. I brought some here to share. And, citron confit in French, which is not really the same as a confit that you would think of, and, like duck confit cooked in fat. But these last, and these add the wonderful flavors to salads or stews, or like I made a chicken tagine, or talking about the Israeli influence, right? An Israeli salad, and I just top some up on top, so they add that bite. And so, like, I can't imagine a Jewish home from anywhere around the world without a pickle in it, or having some sort of pickle connection.
Michelle, I love that. I love that you brought that, and you brought a non-Ashkenazi pickle to remind us of the very clever and resourceful ways that different cultures worked with their local ingredients to both add flavor and to preserve and to have nutritional, certain key nutrients basically to their diet. And so that's a great way of doing it. And I just want to say that our friend Einat Admoni, the chef whose family is Yemenite, Israeli, she has a great tip, which is whenever she squeezes lemons or even zest lemon, she'll then throw them into a jar with salt and some sugar and preserve those, so she doesn't let any that go to waste, and there'll be enough left over in the pulp, enough juice to essentially draw out all that liquid, and basically she preserves her lemon scraps and has such amazing flavor from it. So I would just recommend that as well as a really nice cooking practice.
So this is a way really of not ever letting anything go to waste, right? So if this was seasonal, so in the old country, if cucumbers were seasonal, they'd come and go really quickly. There was a way to enjoy them year round by pickling them or preserving these lemons. Jeffrey, I know you've brought some wonderful old world deliciousness to share with us.
Yeah, well, I will share two things, and then I'll share one thing after Liz shares her other one. The first thing I'm going to share is some herring, and this is
gotta have the herring.
Classic kind of like more of a schmaltz herring in oil, and I brought the herring because it's one of those when you'd have a guest, you'd be greeting a guest, in a lot of Ashkenazi homes back in whatever this term old country is, back in whether it's Warsaw or whether it's my Shums, my grandmother's village, whether it's in Vilna in Lithuania. One of the first things you would offer in a traditional Jewish home would be herring. Why? Well, you had herring preserved. Speaking of preserving, it's fish preserved. You have your barrels or your buckets or or however you kept it in your home. It was transported in big wooden barrels. But you never knew, especially if you were in an observant community, if someone had eaten milk or meat. So were they fleishik or not? And you wanted to offer something that was neutral, that was parve, and but that was still something that was, was both easy. It was already basically, prepared. And so herring was one of those amazing, very nutrient rich as well. A lot of omega-3 fatty acids in here. What a great offering to your guest. And so I always loved that. And if there likely would be pickles there as well. And I just think about that as a way of thinking about how a Jewish food culture emerged out of those constraints. And that's part of that DNA of what Jewish eating is. Yeah.
We have a question from our audience member about one of our audience members about Jewish foods and their evolution on the kashrut or kosher side. So like you mentioned you'd serve fish because it was parve, sort of neutral if you didn't want to offend anybody if they had dairy or meat, milkik, fleishig coming in. How did, there are a couple of questions here. Like some people equate Jewish food with kosher food or vice versa. And I think they're two completely different things. Kosher is a set of laws and rules. I'm not an expert in the rabbinic rules, and we certainly have someone who can help comment on that at American Jewish University. But there's Moroccan food is what I preserve is kosher food, right? Argentine, there's kosher food around the world. And how did the evolution of the deli come to include the mix, of milk and meat? Where did that come from? The idea of the Reuben sandwich to put Swiss cheese on it, that would not have happened in the old world, right? So can you speak to those two things a bit?
Yeah, Liz, why don't you jump in and I'll
Yeah. I mean, the kashrut question is a complicated one, and I think it depends. There's a lot of different perspectives on it. I would say, of course, the dietary laws of kashrut are different than what Jewish food is, but I also think that they're inextricably linked. And I think that Jeffrey and I, when writing the cookbook, really wanted to honor Ashkenazi Jewish food traditions, for example. And so one of the starting points that was very obvious to us is that we were not going to mix milk and meat, because if we were really inspired by Ashkenazi cooking, well, Ashkenazi cooking was by its nature kosher, by the way that it developed. And it doesn't mean that every Ashkenazi Jew kept kosher, but the traditions that grew out of the holidays, that grew out of the communities, were largely influenced by those kashrut rules. So there's a very close linkage, and I think if you try and untangle them too much, you will be confused. It's an overwhelming topic. But I think, of course, today we see differences, and so the deli is a great example. At the turn of the century, what we saw delis opening, right? And then we also would see the dairy restaurant. And there was a wonderful book that came out just this year about the dairy restaurant, an illustrated book. I think it's called The Dairy Restaurant by Ben Catcher. And wonderful book. And that was a restaurant like Ratner's, right? And actually, that's a great spoiler, because what I have right here is actually a bowl of chilled borscht, right? So I've got a beautiful bowl of chilled borscht here, and I've got my sour cream and dill. And that's exactly what would have been served in the dairy restaurant, or maybe pierogi filled with cheese, or blintzes like Jeffrey's eating. And the dairy restaurant was the alternative deli, right? The deli was for meat and the dairy restaurant was for dairy. But as Jews Americanized and became less concerned with kashrut, those dairy restaurants, for many reasons, became less popular. And so some of those dairy restaurant traditions crept into the deli, and some of those dairy restaurant traditions also crept into the bagel shop, I will say. There was also an appetizing shop, which is like a Russ and Daughters. That's like the bagel shop concept, but the idea of having beautiful breads and with butter and spreads, that was also something present in the dairy restaurant that sort of also made its way into the deli and in the bagel shop. So there's some fluidity because American Jews became less concerned or less religious overall.
Yeah, I'll add something else in early immigrant Ashkenazi history in New York. There weren't particularly many rabbis, right? In fact, rabbis in the old world called America the land of treif. This wasn't a particularly kosher place, right? And in fact, there was ad hoc kosher certification. Individual rabbis that did exist would go around and give their stamps, but there was so much fraud that took place that in 1915, there was literally a New York state law that was passed to make it a crime to make, passing something off as kosher that wasn't, to make that a crime, make that illegal. So there was also a...
Right, and part of that is because communities became more fragmented, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in the old, in a shtetl, you could go to your shtetl rabbi. You come to the New World, you can't do that anymore. So
yeah, and it's also, listen, history is messy, even in Eastern Europe. As people were assimilating, as they were westernizing, as they were urbanizing, becoming more like joining the Enlightenment, the Haskalah movement. There was also a departure of a lot of traditions and a lot of kashrut observance to some degree, but there was still a retention of elements of the culture. And I think that's what we see in New York with these delis. And it was from the beginning, it was harder to find a kosher deli. Non-kosher delis were delis that were open on Saturday because it was bad business. And in fact, many couldn't be open on Sunday. And so that was part of that adaptation to the new world. And the story of the Reuben sandwich is that, you got your coleslaw, you got your sauerkraut, you got your corned beef, which itself is, something that was not specifically in its origin a Jewish dish. And there was the back and forth between the Jewish and the Irish community. And then if you think about the Jewish delis today, most of the people who work in them aren't Jewish. And so you're seeing these innovations that happen. One of my favorite examples is in Detroit. There is a chain of restaurants started by I think it's a Vietnamese woman who worked in a Jewish deli and then left and then started corned beef egg rolls with corned beef from that Jewish deli and created a new kind of food. So we start to see these evolutions as well. But the kosher thing, it really is complicated because, one of the most commonly eaten kosher foods today is sushi. And, can you say sushi is a Jewish food? You can say sushi is a food of significance in the Jewish community, but we see a lot of a lot of layers of complexity to this question. Liz, you mentioned the dairy restaurant and you mentioned Ratner's. I just wanted to quickly, I brought blintzes that I made. These are actually not cheese blintzes. These are, I'll leave it on here for a second. These are potato savory blintzes. And these are actually, the crepes are gluten-free crepes. So my partner is gluten-free, and I make blintzes all the time with wheat. But one of the things I wanted to do, in general, is try to open up a lot of these traditions for her. And so there's a few recipes in the book, including a buckwheat bread that's based on an old-fashioned method of making bread that is gluten-free. And in fact, it turns out that there is a Passover tradition for making egg noodles, egg luction, that uses egg. My great aunt Yetta used eggs and just potato starch. Yeah. And I added a little bit of salt, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of milk in this, and I made a gluten-free. Well, the way that you would make the noodles is you'd make a crepe and roll it up and then cut it into noodles. But you could, and this was an old-fashioned way of making a Passover blintz too. And so I decided to make it. It doesn't look as beautiful as a conventional blintz, but it tastes great. And it really opens up a lot of these traditions to people who might otherwise feel like they can't be a part of them.
I love that. I love the connection between the old world and the new world, right? That many people are trying to be gluten-free or have to be gluten-free, that we tap into our old world traditions to find Passover recipes that were naturally gluten-free and able to adapt them today. We have quite a few questions about your recipes from the audience. I have put in the chat a few of Jeffrey and Liz's recipes that they've so kindly shared with us from the Gefilte Manifesto, including one for pickles and borscht. So please feel free to open and download those recipes and enjoy them.
And Michelle, on our website, gefilteria.com/recipes, we can put that in there. There are some additional recipes as well, and we encourage anyone to check those out.
Please, everyone do go ahead and do check those out. So people, we have some real basic questions today. Preserved lemons have to keep refrigerated. Well, first they're preserved and pickled over a course of a week, and then they're refrigerated, which is probably the same case for most pickles. And then someone's asking about what kinds of fish can go into gefilte. Can you have salmon, sole, flounder, whitefish? And are there any other kinds of fish that can be used in gefilte fish?
I love that question because this raises another layer of complexity. Is gefilte fish a dish or a technique? And that is something that Liz and I both fall in the camp of it's a technique. And if we look at what gefilte, a technique of stuffing and or eating the stuffing, so grinding and so gefilte fish in Eastern Europe, was often made with one fish, whether it was carp or a pike. In the New World, speaking to what Liz mentioned about looking for familiarity and flavors, the carp available in the United States was often Asian carp from the Great Lakes, not the same kind of European carp. So you started to see this mixing of different fish together. And so a very common blend is whitefish and carp and pike to approximate the flavor of the gefilte fish made in Poland. When Liz and I went to Poland and we made gefilte fish with a carp, a European carp, we didn't have any blends. It was amazing and tasted completely different than the very gray, muddy flavors of the carp here in the United States. So that was really interesting to us. And we meet people all the time from Seattle who tell us about the lengths they went to get fish from the Great Lakes flown out to their fishmongers so they could make a classic gefilte fish with whitefish and pike and carp. And Liz and I kind of laugh when we hear this because we're like, you live in off the Pacific and there's amazing wild salmon. You should use that, because if we're talking about it as a technique, then you would remove, you basically would want to remove the bones from the flesh. So you'd grind the fish and you could poach it or bake it with onions and spices. And so I love recommending try different fishes. In our recipe, we give a lot of, for gefilte fish, we give a lot of different types you can use. Generally, gefilte fish was often made with a freshwater fish, not with fish from the ocean. And so sometimes fish from the ocean can be a little bit more oily and maybe won't always have the right texture that you want. But I find a lot works, and I would recommend just playing and experimenting, thinking of it as a technique.
So Liz and Jeffrey, who in your lives inspired you to cook? You mentioned some family and aunts and other people in your lives, but where did this come from and inform who you are today?
Well, I like to joke that no one was a big cook in my family, and I think that's why I cook. I grew up with the love of these foods, going to Jewish deli every single week, and eating all the kugels and the briskets, et cetera, on the Jewish holidays. But day by day was just, whatever food, American kids ate. And I didn't come from a big cooking family. And when I moved out of home and went to college when I was 17, that was when I started cooking and hosting meals, and found my way very very quickly to the foods of my tradition, because these were my comfort foods. But I definitely had to learn a lot on my own, and had the luck of working with many great teachers and mentors as a little bit of an older person. But the inspiration, I think, is just, I was always an eater, and I loved the energy of the kitchen, but there was no one there to teach me. So I just dove right in.
Yeah. I appreciate the question, because I mean, there's who inspired me to cook, and there's who inspired me to want to engage with my culture through food, right? And there's, in some ways, they're different questions. And in both cases, my grandma Ruth played a huge role. She would come visit our house for the holidays and always bring with her homemade apple strudel, the one that Liz referenced, with the Smucker's jam in it. But she would also make amazing blintzes, and she was just an all-around great cook. Did everything from scratch. Learned from her mother, who she survived the war with, and she basically learned to cook mostly here in this country, but used to tell stories of her life before the war and her stories of life during the war and tales of survival. And I always remember being so interested in the food pieces of the story, hearing about those plum trees, hearing about the cow that her family had, or the dry goods store her father owned, and her favorite snack of having halva on rye bread, and little details like that that made me really interested in the story that her foods told. And I think that, and a lot of the work that Liz and I do is, yes, we love to cook and put recipes out and cook for people, and we manufacture a gefilte fish, which we sell in stores around the holidays, but we really are as interested, if not more interested, in the stories these foods tell and the ways that these foods are a gateway to understanding Jewish culture, history, and religion. And you can, I like to think of food as a really beautiful, kind of a material history. You can just learning how kitchens operated, how a town was centered around the bakery, how people would come together to make sure everyone had challah on Fridays with wheat flour, which was harder to come by in places like Lithuania. Those stories tell me more about Judaism and about Jewish history than really much of the many of the textbooks that I read in school. And so I love looking at it that way. And part of that was from just hearing Grandma Ruth's stories over the years.
I mean, that has so much warmth and connection to it. Thank you both for sharing those stories with us. So I'm going to take a few more questions from our audience as we get close to the end of our time together here today. So one audience member writes that they've always seen Jewish foods as practical and utilitarian, and sometimes not so aesthetically pleasing. Can Jewish food be gourmet food?
Well, I just want to continue to point out the very specific nature of all the different foods. So Jewish food, we always like to get specific. So Ashkenazi Jewish food is probably what we're talking about here, because that's the food that maybe has the cuisine that maybe has the worst reputation, right, for being bland or boring. And that's a lot of why we think that that reputation is a lot of reason why many of our culinary colleagues sort of had abandoned or forgotten about it, or even people in our generation. And so can Ashkenazi food be gourmet? I think absolutely. And I think it's also just depends on how you define gourmet. So one of the best, most popular ways to eat right now is farm to table, right? It's all about what's local. It's all about what's in season. And just going one more time down to my awesome bowl of borscht here, these are locally grown beets. This is a beautiful organic sour cream that, if I was closer to a dairy, could have been made from a local cow. This is fresh dill that is clearly in season right now. And so, borscht might be considered a hometown food, a homegrown food, but I'd say that this definitely falls in the category of the way that we talk about gourmet now. And one of the reasons that I think that maybe, there's an association with Ashkenazi food not being gourmet or upscale is also because this is food that we often eat at home and not necessarily food that we eat in restaurants. But I think that there's so many beautiful, tremendous dishes like this beautiful farm to table borscht that I've got going on here that would fall into the gourmet category. So that's just one example. I'm sure you have more to add, Jeffrey, about that.
I'll say the word utilitarian. I don't love that word, but I do like the word resourcefulness, right? Being resourceful. So these foods are resourceful, and I think that one of the things we're finding right now with a growing interest in environmentalism, in zero waste. You actually look to an Ashkenazi kitchen as a zero waste kitchen. Nothing went to waste. And my grandmother, when she survived in Siberia, always told me the potato peels could be a meal, right? Like everything, there's nutrients, there's flavor, it can be used. And so what we actually look to a lot is some of that wisdom to inform how we can, elevate these foods. So, and that means sometimes by fermenting, a lot of the tradition of fermented dairy, right? We can incorporate into our borscht to sour it. Or in fact, there's a whole tradition of fermenting your beets to sour your borscht to bring about the flavors in this really nuanced way that, as opposed to a lot of the vinegar that gets added to, which is acetic acid, which is a bit more harsh, which gets added to flavor borscht. So thinking about that resourcefulness right now, that is something that is really in the fanciest kitchens around the world. Places like Noma, by the way, one of the top restaurants in the world just put out a fermentation book. And the book has lots of recipes for a lot of the foods and practices that were part of the Eastern European tradition. Foraging right now is all the rage. So Liz mentioned all those things. I would also say there is this idea that, because the majority of Ashkenazi Jews were not affluent, but there were certainly, there was middle class, there was a middle class, there were affluent Jews in Eastern Europe, there were variations. And you can only look to German Jewish history and German Jewish cooking to see a more elevated, fancy version of a lot of Ashkenazi foods. And some of that is how it's, a lot of fancier china that the foods are served on, and little elements of influence from French cooking, styles of garnishing and all that were incorporated into these more affluent Jewish homes. And so again, that one of the themes is that, that this picture of this impoverished Jewish community isn't necessarily the only picture, and it's not accurate, and there's certainly different ways, and the foods were elevated in the past, and they can certainly be elevated now. And I think it's all about the values we bring, and just really how we interpret these foods for the future. And right now, there's all sorts of chefs right now, including one of the top chefs in Argentina, who's got a celebrated restaurant called Meshugana, who is serving gefilte fish and these beautiful pastrami rib roasts, and who is basically, he probably has one of the fanciest Ashkenazi Jewish restaurants in the world. And so it's proof that it can be done, and it is being done.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that light with us, that there is elegance in the foods that we eat. And I know we can continue talking for hours about the different countries that inform the Ashkenazi Jewish food experience, the impact of the Russian, the Polish, the German, the Ukrainian, the Latvian, all the different foods and where they come from. I have shared the recipes in the chat. They're also available on our website, www.aju.edu/beyachad together, where I encourage the audience to go to and visit to see upcoming offerings for the Beyachad Together platform. I believe Einat Edmoni, who Jeffrey mentioned, will be in conversation with us on July 10th. The event is not up just yet, but we will have it up very soon. She writes the cookbook Shuk, and then you shared some other wonderful cookbooks. I love your library of books behind you, Jeffrey. As we wrap up today, I want to thank Jeffrey and Liz and you, the audience, for joining us and sharing your words of wisdom, your food, your recipes from the audience and from Jeffrey and Liz. This has been a program of Beyachad Together, spirited by American Jewish University. Again, I invite you to visit our website, www.aju.edu/Beyachad Together. I will put that in the chat for the audience so it's easily available to you. Next week, we have programming leading up to the 4th of July and Independence Day. And we will be welcoming Dr. Bruce Powell, an adjunct AJU faculty member, to talk about Judaism's influence on the founding of our nation. On Tuesday, Dr. Robbie Totten, political scientist and AJU's chief academic officer, will be in conversation with David Scott Fitzgerald discussing the crisis within a crisis in immigration in the time of pandemic. And then on Wednesday, we welcome AJU alum and Jewish educator Danny Goldblatt, owner of the Kosher Holy Smokes Barbecue, as we prep for the 4th of July. So we look forward to seeing you all online. We thank you for learning with us and for being with us. We wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, a peaceful Shabbat. Thank you, Jeffrey and Liz, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you, Michelle. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, Michelle.